Okay, today we're talking about the classification of constitutions, and my intention with this presentation is to provide you with a brief theoretical outline, and then in the lecture following this we would discuss the classification of the South African Constitution in relation to the different modes of classification. Now, before we delve right into the classification systems, let's just take a brief look at how constitutions come into existence and the importance of context. First of all, constitutions come into existence for a variety of reasons. They come into existence because there's been a change, a radical change in government. In other words, the existing government is overthrown, there was a revolution in the full sense of the word, and a new constitution is drafted for the new state that is established after the revolution. But a constitution also comes into existence when a state is granted independence. And for many African states that previously were colonies, after the 1950s, many African states became independent. They adopted constitutions to mark the independence. And then there are other constitutions that come about organically, naturally, as a result of slow, incremental change over time. So there is no one single constitution that is a model, that is perfect, that is fantastic, and the answer to all questions and issues regarding governance. Constitutions necessarily are intertwined with the social, political, and economic context of the particular society for which it was adopted. So what I'm saying to you is that constitutions must be understood in the complex reality in which they operate. Context, Lord Steyn said in the case of Ex parte Daily, which was a House of Lords decision, that context in law is all. So, now that I've said how important context is, why do I bother with general classification systems? Why do we classify if each and every constitution is so incredibly unique? Modes of classifications enable us to identify core features of any given system and assess its suitability in that particular context. Let me repeat that. Modes of classification enable us to identify the core feature of systems and assess its suitability in the particular context. It's not a competition, but it is a question of whether that particular mode, that particular aspect that we are honing in on, whether that is suitable in the particular polity. So I want to start with codified and uncodified, and this is really relatively simple, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. A codified constitution is a constitution is in the instance where we find a statute-like document. What is a statute? That is an act of parliament or an act of the legislature. A statute-like document dealing with the distribution of power between the main organs of state, the relationship between them, and the relationship between these organs and individual citizens. You've read that definition before. You've heard it before. That is the definition of constitutional law. So in the instance where we have a single statute-like document, typically one that calls itself the Constitution, that deals with those important aspects of constitutional law, the distribution of powers between the main organs of state, the relationship between those organs, and the relationship between the organs of state and the individuals, then we have a codified constitution. In the instance of an uncodified constitution, there is no such document. There is not a single document. So, for example, in Israel, there are 9 documents that make up the constitution. In New Zealand and in the United Kingdom, there are no single documents that make up the constitution. And in each instance, the context of the particular state will dictate whether this is appropriate or not. Okay, that is the first classification, and I want you to think about the classification of the South African Constitution. The second mode of classification that I quickly want to run through, which is also not tough at all, is rigid and flexible. And this refers to the relative ease or difficulty of the amendment of such a constitution. Okay, what does flexible mean? It means bendy, it means malleable, it means manipulable. So a flexible constitution is one that could be amended relatively easily. So a flexible constitution, that's not very difficult. There are no special majorities, there's no entrenchment of the constitution, and it can be amended with a simple legislative amendment. A rigid constitution, on the other hand, is a constitution where there are special majorities, where there are entrenchments, where there are special procedures prescribed in the constitution for the amendment of that constitution. Okay, earlier on I said that the United Kingdom does not have a written constitution. The United Kingdom's constitution can be found in a variety of sources, including statutes, including customs, including conventions, including a variety of other judicial pronouncements and so forth. If there was to be a change to the United Kingdom Constitution in the absence of a prescribed process to be followed, we can say then that the Constitution of the United Kingdom is flexible because it can be amended with a simple legislative amendment. Germany, on the other hand, has a entrenched constitution which requires special majorities and special procedures to change that constitution. And in certain instances, some of the pronouncements or some of the aspects of the constitution is said to be unamendable. And that then points to rigidity. Now, the important thing that you have to bear in mind is that whether a constitution is rigid or flexible doesn't really indicate whether it is amended regularly or not. The Swiss constitution is an example of a rigid constitution where each and every amendment is subjected to a referendum. What is a referendum? It's a question that is put out to the public. Do you want the minister to serve a term longer than the minister of a particular portfolio to serve a very long term, or whatever the case may be of the particular amendment? You put that to people in a question, the citizenry, and they have to vote yes or no. You can see that that's quite a cumbersome process to try and amend a constitution, but the Swiss constitution is amended fairly often. Okay, now the next one, and this is important because this is something that we're going to discuss in more detail in relation to the South African Constitution in a couple of weeks. But I want you to get to grips with the theory of this. The division, the classification, unitary and federal. This refers to the relative centralization or decentralization of governmental power in a state. The relative centralization or decentralization of governmental power. In a unitary system, power is centralized. So in other words, it is the national government as opposed to the government in provinces or states that make up that particular state that wields the most power. The power is derived from the Constitution, whether written or unwritten, and the scope of the power of the national sphere extends much further than the delegated authority given to the subnational units. Let me say that again. In a unitary state, the subnational units, the provinces of that unitary state, does not have original constitutional power. It has power derived from legislation passed in the national tier, and that legislation grants delegated authority to the subnational tier. So it's important to note that there is no original legislative and executive authority for the subnational units in a unitary state. In a federal state, there is a decentralization of power. So in other words, there is original power granted in the Constitution to the subnational units. So where you have provinces, or where you have subnational units called states, they derive their authority from the Constitution itself. Can you see how that is different from a unitary state? And in many instances, as in South Africa, we have national government, provincial government, and local government, where you have a true or a quasi-federal system. There is some original constitutional power given to the subnational units at all the levels. So there is relative autonomy and relative substantive power that is wielded in the subnational bodies. Okay, a closer look. In unitary states, and I'm repeating myself to some extent here, but this is quite important to get to grips to, the subnational units have no original powers. The subnational units have no original powers. What is original power? That is one that is derived from the Constitution itself. The powers are derived from ordinary national legislation, and the particular subnational unit, the province for that matter, may do no more than what that legislation allows. If the legislation of the national parliament says the province may make legislation in respect of cultural activities, and then it specifies which activities they may make legislation about, that is it. It may not go outside that prescribed list of activities in the legislation of what it may do. And all other power, and that is what I mean by residual power, all other power that is not tightly circumscribed in legislation vests in the national tier. Does that make sense? All the power that is specifically circumscribed in legislation and delegated to a subnational unit vests in that unit. But where the legislation is silent, it doesn't say who can wield that power. That power is wielded at the national level of government. In a federal system, though, on the other hand, we have subnational units with original legislative powers. That is derived from the Constitution. Can you see the source of the power in the instance is very different? And in a true federation, specific powers are assigned to the national or the federal government. Can you see this is completely the opposite of the unitary system, in the sense that there's a list of things that the national or the federal government may do, and all the other power vests in the subnational units. The residual power is now with the provinces or the states. Okay. Now, further, what we have to look at is that there can be relationships, and there is necessarily a relationship between the federal government, that is the national government, and the subnational unit. And you get an integrated or a divided federation. In a divided federal system, the two tiers, the national and the provincial, or the federal and the state, operate independently. And in an integrated federation, there is an overlap of competences and a formal involvement of the subnational units in the decision-making processes. Okay? So in an integration, that, as the word says, there's a working together. Divided, there's separation between the units. If you have more questions about this, I will answer these in class. Okay, parliamentary and presidential systems. What is a parliamentary system? In a parliamentary system, and this takes us to separation of powers, which we will take a very close look at in due course, the members of the executive are members of the legislature. So, we vote in an election. Who do we vote for? We vote for members of the legislature. And in terms of the rules of the system, the majority political party, because that's the vehicle that we use, the majority political party in the legislature has the right to form a government. When it forms the government, the members of the executive are taken from the legislature. So they play a dual role. They are members of parliament, but they are also ministers. And the reason for this is, the rationale for a parliamentary system is that it provides for stable and responsible government. However, the flip side of that coin is the presidential system. And here there are two separate elections. There are different political mandates given to the executive on the one hand, that is the president and his cabinet, or the members of the executive, and the members of the legislature. And the reason for this is to ensure that there are checks and balances within the framework of separation of powers. So in other words, you set these two political mandates up as possibly clashing to keep each other in line. So that is to ensure accountability. Lastly, other classifications, and I'm not going to say much about this because I think it speaks for itself. One gets a one-party or a multi-party constitution. I don't really want to say too much about one-party constitutions because I don't really know why you bother to have a constitution when only a single party participates. And then a monarchical or a republican constitution. A republic, what is a republic? It is a political order where the supreme power lies in the body of citizens who are entitled to vote for officers and representatives who account to them. So in a republic, the power vests in the people. In a monarchy, the power vests in a monarch, a king or a queen. Nowadays, in the most instances where you have a monarchical constitution, the person, the monarch, fulfills a symbolic role as the head of state, but wields no real executive power. Okay, that then about classifications. Remember that they allow us to determine the suitability of a particular aspect of a constitution in a particular context. If you have questions about this, and I think there may be questions about unitary and federal, please prepare these and bring them to class. Thanks.